And a very warm welcome to the second oral evidence session for delivering the Child Poverty Strategy, a joint inquiry between the Work and Pensions Select Committee and also the Education Select Committee. And we're delighted to welcome our first panel. We have Dr. Matt Barnes from the University of London. We have Baroness Ruth Lister, who is one of our colleagues here, but also an Emeritus professor from Loughborough University. And then we have Ed McPherson from WPI Economics, and Professor Ruth Patrick from the University of Glasgow. I need to declare some interest, and I know there are other members that do as well. So apart from knowing our esteemed colleague from the House of Lords, Ruth Lister, I am also an acquaintance of Professor Ruth Patrick as well. And I also need to say in panel 2, Alun Francis is a former colleague from Oldham as well. Does anybody else want to declare an interest?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm the Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Social Mobility, which the Sutton Trust is the Secretariat for.
Thank you. Again, a warm welcome. I am going to start the questions, if that's okay. So obviously the government strategy for child poverty, when it was published last year, was very ambitious in terms of what it set out about reducing child poverty. And their own models estimate that 500,000 children will be lifted out of poverty. But at the same time, by 2030, the government estimates that only 30% of children, there will still be 30% of children living in poverty. So what other measures do you think that we need to be taken to strengthen this, to shift the dial around child poverty, to make that real impact in driving down child poverty? Who would like to kick off with that big question?
I mean, I'll say something to start. Thanks very much for inviting me to give evidence. I think the first thing to really emphasise is the ambition that is contained within that commitment, which has obviously now been realised, to remove the two-child limit. And that's one that definitely the sort of academic evidence really supported. All the evidence supported is really essential to drive child poverty down. And one of the things that's particularly significant about getting rid of the two-child limit was the way in which, while it was in place, it was eroding that kind of link between need and entitlement within our social security system. So that's the idea that the kind of assessment and the decision about what somebody's entitled to is linked to what they actually need. So, really good that the two-child limit has gone, but I think we still have policies in place in our social security system that do erode that link. And the one that I know most about and think is urgently needs to go is the benefit cap. So one of the frustrations that I think I may share with other kind of giving evidence during the time that we were seeing the debate about the two-child limit was people were often talking about it as a two-child benefit cap. And I think that kind of eroded understandings about the fact that there are actually two separate policies. So there's the two-child limit, which restricts entitlement for the first two children, or did historically, and then there's a benefit cap. But the thing about the benefit cap is it places a completely arbitrary limit on the amount a household can receive, irrespective of need. And the research that I've done with colleagues at the LSE, so Kitty Stewart and Aaron Reeves, it's really investigating the impact of both policies, and it really showed us how the benefit cap pushes families far below the poverty line. So it really has a massively detrimental impact, and the families it affects are some of the most vulnerable in society. So I think getting rid of the benefit cap is a real priority, and I'll shut up because the only other thing I'll say is that there's also just a broader need. We need to see investment in social security in the round. So I think it's really important that the two-child limit is positioned as a first step, but it is the beginning of a longer journey.
I would agree with Ruth on everything she said, both the ambition, and the delight. I don't think I was the only person who cried tears of joy when they heard that the two-child limit was being abolished. But I agree with Ruth that the benefit cap really needs to go, particularly from the perspective of deep poverty. But I know the government has set its face against this, so at the very least, the thresholds for the cap should be uprated annually in line with Universal Credit Standard Allowance. And I would also argue, as did some of my colleagues now on the front bench at the time when the legislation was going through, child benefit should not be included in the benefit cap, because if we're comparing incomes in and out of work, then your working family is getting child benefit, so it doesn't make sense. It's not an equal playing field. But I would also argue the other immediate priority is local housing allowance, which is being frozen yet again. And the evidence suggests that, and the child poverty strategy itself makes the point, that increasingly housing costs are a driver of poverty, particularly in the private rented sector. Yeah. So we do need to, I think, that needs to be uprated annually. But in the longer term, like Ruth, I think there has to be more investment in social security. I'd like to see an independent review of the adequacy of social security benefits. I mean, it's good. I very much welcome that the real level of universal credit standard allowance is being increased, but the government itself accepts that it's being done so only modestly. And I would draw the committee's attention to an article that I think just came out online this week from the Journal of Social Policy, which does suggest that long-term investment in redistribution, social security, has an impact on long-term child poverty. It's not just a quick fix, yes. It does have that long-term effect.
Thank you. Edwin, Matt, who would like to go next?
I think I'd agree with what the others have said, of course. I think a strategy that focuses on the key drivers of poverty, so income from work, income from social security, cost of essentials, I think that's incredibly important and useful. We have a particular interest in researching those in kind of deep and complex poverty, so I think we'll talk a bit more about that later, but focusing on the families that suffer from very low financial resources and have multiple drivers of poverty, particularly that have lasted for years, so in a kind of persistent cycle of disadvantage. I think focusing on them is particularly important.
Thank you.
I might just quickly introduce myself and why I'm here. So I'm representing WPI Economics, and we provided the Secretariat for the Social Metrics Commission, which is a commission led by Baroness Stroud to work on a new measure of poverty and to work through issues related to poverty measurement. We also provided the modelling and the Secretariat for the Poverty Strategy Commission, which was a commission led by Baroness Stroud to look at the issue of poverty alleviation in the UK and to try and build political consensus around poverty alleviation in the UK. I would agree that the removal of the two-child limit is a good thing. It breaks the link between need and provision. It's also, not from a moral standpoint, it's just very, very efficient. If you look at the amount of money that you need to spend to move children out of poverty, removing the two-child limit is one of the most cost-effective ways of reducing child poverty. The two-child limit was a very effective way of leaving children in poverty, is the two-child limit, almost bizarrely so, actually. I would say the other two things, the local housing allowance and the benefit cap, I think are really compelling because there's a clear argument around unfairness. It breaks the link between need and provision. A measure that doesn't necessarily address the fairness argument as cleanly is just, and this feels obvious, is just raising the amount of money that you give to children through universal credit. We've seen the Scottish child payment that has demonstrably reduced child poverty rates in Scotland. When you model an extension of that to the UK, it's very effective as well. And I mean, it feels too obvious to say, but just putting money into that aspect of the universal credit system is a very effective way of targeting child poverty if you have a significant amount of money to throw into a social security measure.
Thank you. Can I ask a really quick question and a quick response, if that's okay? Some academics have said that there needs to be a greater degree of coordination between government departments around child poverty, and they refer to, for example, the Health and Equalities Strategy, which made a massive difference around reducing infant mortality through reducing child poverty. So what are your views on that? If you don't have them, that's fine, but a very quick one, if that's all right.
Because we're both Ruths.
I
think that's one of the great strengths of the way that the strategy has been developed, is that it is cross-government and recognises responsibility of all departments, even if, in fact, we'll come on to talk a bit later about the Home Office, which doesn't seem to see its responsibility in quite the same way. But I was very struck by the written evidence that the departments gave to you, where they said government is also committed to maintain a core central child poverty team with cross-government oversight by ministers. Well, that's not what I'd understood. If that's the case, that's excellent. But my fear is, and I think the fear of many people, that by simply putting it in DWP, which obviously is very important, that you could lose sight of that. So I'd also like to, I thought a rather good model was provided by the social cohesion strategy, which is proposing a new ministerial steering group with regular reporting to the Prime Minister. Now, I think that is absolutely crucial, and given that it's our, or the Labour Party's the government's moral mission, that might help maintain that cross-government approach, which I do think is absolutely crucial.
Does anybody want to add anything very briefly?
Yeah, can I just say very quickly that I agree that it is super, super important to have that cross-governmental approach and also have that kind of ministerial commitment and leadership and accountability, and I would argue that that should be at the sort of Secretary of State level. But the other thing, just to say really quickly, is just to give a live example. I think at the moment we're having like too many kind of policy debates in silos. So if we look at kind of poverty and SEND, so children with additional needs, and then economic inactivity and needs, I think too often those issues aren't being joined up. And actually, so the DWP is very concerned about high levels of needs, and then the DFEs can obviously highly concerned about how they reform provision for SEND. But actually, we need to have that cross-governmental approach, because if we could, and I think it's exactly the same, with child poverty, because we know the harm that does to sort of education. Yeah.
I think health comes into there somewhere. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Jo Baxter.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Can I ask, what extent do you think the employment-related policies outlined in the strategy will help reduce child poverty, and are the changes the government are pursuing the right ones to support parents? Who wants to start?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I was sort of, I think one of the key things that we have to get right when we're talking about child poverty is being clear about the role that employment can play within an effective action to get child poverty down. And I think for many, many years we've heard this kind of buzzword, work is the best route out of poverty, and that kind of buzzword just collides with the evidence. So, there is, as we all know, a very high rate of in-work poverty. So again, working with Kitty Stewart and Aaron Reeves, in about kind of October last year, we did a kind of piece of analysis that was saying, what can be achieved with employment alone on child poverty, and our kind of conclusion was, you can't actually get very far. So I think even with the really, really ambitious employment targets of 80%, and if we were to kind of assume that they applied to parents and second earners, we would only lift about I think it was like 100,000 children out of poverty. So it wasn't sufficient. And I think the reason, there's lots of reasons for that, and because of length I don't have to go into them all now unless you want them, but one of the key reasons is that it is social security that we need. Social security, and the role of social security has always, or should be, to adapt for periods over our life course where our needs are higher. Those of us with children, young children, children in their teens, we know that at those periods our kind of household needs, our expenditure is higher, and wage can't do that alone. And if we look at the kind of the trend line, the trajectory of poverty over time, we just see that very clearly writ large on the kind of evidence base. So when social security support is reduced, child poverty rates go up. When it's increased, child poverty rates go down. So it's a kind of really interesting policy sphere in a way, because we know very clearly what the fixes are, but it's having the commitment to make them. So I won't say more now unless you want me to.
I would agree with that. Obviously employment is important for a whole host of reasons, but it isn't the primary lever and I've been very struck by the analysis that Ruth was contributed to, and the article I mentioned earlier about long-term poverty again found that policies on employment were less effective than were policies on social security in terms of addressing long-term child poverty. But in terms of, there are clearly important things to be done, and it's very much, I think, about reducing the barriers which to employment, particularly for mothers. And those barriers go very wide, like transport. I mean, that's an example of how the cross-government approach is so necessary, particularly, or if you're in a rural area, public transport can be absolutely crucial in terms of being being able to find work. And I don't think the strategy talks about one other possible lever, which is a second earner work allowance and universal credit, because the total worklessness is not the issue it used to be. But if you want to get more people on universal credit into paid work in two-parent families, then you have to think about the second earner. And it is very difficult for a second earner at present. So I'd throw that into this little pot.
Yeah, I think it's clear that large-scale unemployment isn't the driver of child poverty now that it was when child poverty was high in the 90s, for example. A lot of people have children who are in poverty, they're in work, it might be part-time work, the conditions might be quite bad. Measures to improve the stability of their work, so guaranteed hours and improved employment rights, are good and will improve their experience of poverty, but they won't necessarily show up in poverty metrics just as a consequence of how poverty is measured. If you have two families in an income survey, one of which has really wildly erratic hours and an employer who messes them around and who tells them that their hours are cancelled when they're halfway to work, versus another person who earns the same amount with a really considerate employer who respects their time, ultimately they have the same weekly earnings, so they're going to be in the same place relative to the poverty line. So measures to improve people's experience through improving the solidity of their work, it just doesn't necessarily show up in poverty measures, and that's just a consequence of the way that we have to measure poverty, the kind of armoury that we have to try and measure the problem. I think if you do want to look at how far those policies will reduce poverty in the long run, you need to go and assess those policies individually, look at the mechanisms by which you think improving people's security and employment might lead them to take on more hours or to take on training or whatever else, and then to try and actually assess those channels specifically. Because I think making those changes and expecting that to show up in a large swing in the kind of top level child poverty numbers, you're not going to see it. Not because they're not good policies, but just because of the way that child poverty is measured.
Sorry, I should also have mentioned childcare, which obviously is absolutely crucial to enabling people to access paid work. But I think also childcare should be seen as a right, as something important in its own right for children, and therefore shouldn't simply be tied to employment in the way it is at present.
Yes, I was just going to repeat what the others have said, really. I think it's the issue that, if you're in a working family in poverty, it's that sort of combination of low pay, low hours, insecure work, but also how that's going to interact with other problems that families have, so the childcare constraints, disability, health, caring, insecure housing costs. So obviously important in their own right, but kind of understood as a kind of wider package of policies.
Could I just say one really, really quick follow-up thing, which is also we have to think about the role of the inadequacy of social security, of actually making it harder to kind of get into, move into good work. So just to give the example of the benefit cap, some early analysis we did of that showed that it was actually pushing people further away to the labour market, because if you imagine the extent and the experience of destitution, and we know that from the qualitative evidence base as well as the quantitative evidence base, that can actually push people further away from the labour market. So I think we have to recognise that, giving people a kind of adequate bedrock, or giving people a kind of sense, so if you're thinking about the ideas of security that you were talking about, Ed, that can be achieved through the labour market, but it can also be achieved through the social security system, and its absence can also make the achievement of progression and entries into work harder.
Serena Brackenridge.
Okay, thank you. Ed, I heard that you stated that it is difficult to make an estimate of the impact of employment related policies to the number of children in child poverty. However, is there an estimate out there? What's the scale of the issue of children who are in poverty and impacted on employment related policies?
I think it's something that would be difficult to measure. Certainly we've not necessarily attempted it recently. I think the strategy avoids estimating it for quite a good reason, in that it doesn't necessarily always show up cleanly in child poverty impacts. I do think that if you do want to know the extent to which employment measures are going to reduce child poverty, and this is a kind of unhelpful answer, but what you would have to do is be quite clear about saying, well, these are the channels that we think are going to be in play. We think that if you improve people's stability in employment, this reduces their cognitive load, which means that they're more able to go and do other things. They're more able to go into training or education. They're more able to request more work and to get more hours. They're more able to progress into higher paid work because they could be more proactive and more front foot because they're not in a defensive position about their employment rights. I think you would need to kind of articulate what those channels are and then do some proper economic evaluation work as to whether or not those channels are in play and as to whether or not those changes are measurable. And then I think you would probably try and get at a poverty estimate that way from the mechanisms. As I say, it is difficult to get at it using microdata, using FRS and HBAI, which is the standard approach, because a lot of the changes won't have immediate impacts. And if you look at a family in the 2029 FRS and they're in a reasonably good job and there's stability of employment there and they're just above the poverty line, there's no way of knowing that they're in that position because of indirectly an employment rights reform that was made several years previously. It's just impossible to untangle that because of how complicated all of these issues are. So I would say kind of policy level evaluations informed by a kind of economic model of what it is you're trying to achieve would be the best way of teasing out the child poverty impacts of the government's various employment programmes and changes to employment law.
Can I just quickly, though, come back to that 100,000 figure? Because I think that if we look at the sort of totality of the measures, that were being proposed in the strategy, even, and the broader kind of objectives around moving towards full employment, even if all of that was to be successful, like the modelling does suggest that the total impact would only be to lift 100,000 children out of poverty. And if we kind of even just make that contrast, with the impact that the 2-child limit removal is going to have, we can already see the relative role being played by sort of social security versus employment. Just in terms of some of the evidence base as well, it's worth saying that because of all the work that was done, especially in the new Labour years, to try and support more and more families into employment, and the moves we've seen over time from a kind of single adult worker to a 2-worker family model norm, what we describe in our kind of analysis with LSE is the kind of low-hanging fruit on employment has already been kind of won. It's already been harvested. And so in terms of the figures, if we look at who is currently out of work, who are the workless families, they are families that often face very kind of profound barriers to work. So nearly 9 in 10 of the remaining workless families face at least one significant barrier to work, and among them, I'm just trying to see, half have a child under 5, half have an adult with a disability or long-standing health condition, and nearly 3 in 10 have a child with a disability. Yeah. So we all know, don't we, that those are quite substantial barriers to work. And actually, when we've looked at the costs, the potential costs then of effective employment support, it's it was a figure that we, was based on some analysis. We thought it could cost up to £15 billion in additional employment support to actually get people with those kind of substantial barriers to employment back. And that's not to say, just again, it will be I agree with Ruth that employment is useful and important for lots of reasons, but we've just got to be clear in the role it can play in tackling child poverty.
Could I just say there that it's often assumed that raising the minimum wage is a kind of important tool. It's important in its own right, but actually it's a very blunt tool when it comes to tackling child poverty.
Thank you. Moving on, and we're going to start with Damien Egan and then move on to Darren Paffy.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to focus now on how we measure poverty, and we've got the newly developed deep poverty metric, and so I'd like to ask each of the panel what you make of that in terms of, I guess, looking at the positive side of that, but also the risks that come with it as well.
Shall I go first? I think it's an important measure. So I think it improves the measure that focuses purely on income, the 60% median measure, which of course is very important. it's been around for ages, is useful for sort of trends and comparative reasons. But I think the deep material poverty metric, it's much more about the lived experience of poverty, tells you much more about affordability in terms of, poverty's not just about your income, but there's other costs related to that, debts, disability-related expenses, kind of those wider financial pressures that the material poverty measure picks up, that the low-income measure as it stands doesn't, although the SMC measure, which I'm sure we'll hear more about, does go some way to kind of capturing that more financial, those financial struggles. A couple of things that it doesn't do around kind of complexity of poverty. So this idea that we're very interested in, that certain types of poverty can differ from each other, that people in poverty can have a number of drivers that isn't kind of uncovered by that measure. Also, it doesn't measure persistence. So I think poverty is very much about low financial resources, complex backgrounds, in other words, families with multiple drivers, and then it's about persistence as well, and that's a kind of static measure. I think the other challenge with that measure is how it overlaps with the low income measure. So when you look at families in poverty, you actually see kind of the minority that are on low income that are also in material deprivation, and obviously there's lots of reasons why that is, but I think that can sometimes be quite confusing to communicate those statistics. Again, I think the SMC measure that gets at financial resources a bit more, in a different way, brings in some of these challenges, does overlap better with the deprivation measure. And I think, again, for kind of understanding poverty, which is obviously a really difficult concept to measure, I think there's an advantage where the measures are kind of talking to each other a bit more.
Yeah, of course. So I think the deep material poverty measure is a big potential issue with it. Is just that it's difficult to operationalise. You can't really forecast it. You can look at what likely changes in income might be, but there's no way of knowing how people are going to choose to spend that money. It's difficult to forecast how much more expensive energy might get and the various other things that are considered as essentials. Where I think it is useful is as something of a sanity check next to the relative poverty measure. The reason being, 60% of median income relative poverty is useful in a lot of ways. There's a long time series for it. It's internationally comparable because most European countries keep a time series of relative poverty on that measure. But there are issues with it. One of them is that just looking at income, net of taxes and benefits and net of housing spend, doesn't always tell you how dire somebody's immediate financial situation might be. There might be costs related to disability. There might be costs related to childcare. They may or may not have other assets that they can use to try and support their consumption. That means that it doesn't necessarily always line up very well with things like deprivation and food bank usage necessarily. The SMC tries to correct for some of those things by adding and deducting more things to account for the actual resources that a family might have. The other thing that relative poverty measures sometimes do is go down even if there isn't a real improvement in people's lived position. So if, for example, there was a large inflationary spike caused by an increase in the price of petrol, hypothetically, and incomes in the middle of the income distribution fell behind inflation by a couple of percentage points, there was a slight real terms erosion in median income. But people at the low end of the spectrum, because a lot more of their income is indexed, because they're on benefits, they're on the state pension, they're on minimum wage, which is uprated every year. Incomes at the bottom end might keep up with inflation, whereas incomes in the middle of the distribution might fall behind inflation. What that would end up with is a fall in median income, a fall in the poverty line, and therefore a reduction in the number of people who are in relative poverty. obviously what you wouldn't want to do is then declare victory and say that relative poverty has fallen. And I think that's where something like deep material poverty is useful, because it shows you that actually the position of families at the bottom end of the income distribution hasn't improved. The change that you're seeing as a result of macroeconomic circumstances. It's the reason why HBI reports absolute poverty alongside relative poverty, is to try and avoid that kind of statistical artifice. So I think deep material poverty is a useful sanity check to report alongside the headline measure, just to cut through when the headline measure might misbehave, if that makes any sense.
Having written a book on the concept of poverty, I'm absolutely clear that no measure of poverty is perfect. I mean, it's trying to measure something that is not totally measurable. I think the 60% of median income is the best we have for the reasons already given. And I think it is useful to add a kind of material deprivation measure to that. But I personally, I think it would be a good idea to come back to also to have alongside that a very low income measure. Say, I mean, I don't know what percentage of median income, it might be 40, 50% of median income, because that would allow you to make a direct comparison between what's happening with poverty generally and what's happening with poverty, deep poverty. And you can't compare, I mean, it's like apples and pears to compare material deprivation figures with income figures. So I don't, and now that the government has, the DWP has improved its measure of poverty to include administrative data on benefit receipt, I think that might address one of the arguments that's been made against using the very low income measure, because it's very difficult, that the data are very difficult to be sure that you've got it right. So I think it might be easier to do that now.
Okay, Darren Paffy, and can I just say we're getting a little bit behind, so if we can be concise with our responses, if that's okay. Over to you, Darren.
Okay. My question specifically to Dr. Barnes. In your evidence, you say that the government should pay explicit attention to those who are experiencing deep and complex poverty. Just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how you're defining deep and complex poverty as opposed to different definitions of poverty. And what in practice does that mean for our ability to track the progress of the child poverty strategy as it goes forward?
Yes, the centre that I work at has a particular interest in deep and complex poverty, and as I've said, we're actually working to operationalise it at the moment, but it's very much about families that have very low financial resources, and then sitting alongside that, which I think is going to be the case for many families in that situation, but perhaps isn't visualised in the statistics, is having these kind of multiple interacting drivers of poverty. So, here we're talking about, the things we talked about with employment, so either out of work or low paid, low hours of work, but also on top of that having health or disability, problems, high housing cost, debt, caring responsibilities, and particularly where those situations have happened over a number of years persistently for those families. So I think for that deep and complex poverty really gets at a particular type of poverty, which is probably going to see the families with the lowest financial resources persistently, and so having some kind of measure that can identify those and track those, I think would help to understand whether the strategy and policies around those kind of families are working. So, I mean, those kind of things are possible to measure in the data that we have. So, in the HBAI report that comes out every year, there's lots of statistics, sometimes sort of hidden away in Excel spreadsheets and things like that, but that show particular characteristics of people in poverty. And some of these drivers are captured in those statistics, but what you don't get is poverty rates for families that have combinations of those factors. We did some analysis a few years ago now, which needs updating, that showed, as we all understand, people in poverty don't have the same circumstances. So we created typologies that identified different types of poverty, which would situate people with different levels of financial resources, but also with different combinations of drivers. And that was very useful to kind of create those typologies and track how those families are doing in terms of their financial resources and how policies help, particular typologies of poverty.
You mentioned, I think, that there are drivers that the deep material poverty measures don't necessarily capture. You may have already had a chance to kind of highlight what those drivers are, but would you bring them to our attention again? Is there anything we should be looking at that isn't necessarily covered, what those drivers
Well,
are?
I think the measures of poverty are more, that exist at the moment. The low income one, the deep material poverty measures are kind of identifying you as being in poverty. That's kind of what the measures of poverty are. I think the drivers are the things that can impact or cause those circumstances. And so a lot of them are mentioned in the strategy, and it focuses, the things that we've been talking about. But I think what we're missing a bit is identifying families that have multiple of those and really making that really clear. And you'd imagine it's the families that have the multiple complex drivers that are the hardest to tackle, that are going to be in poverty more persistently, and often need more joined up kind of policy solutions. And again, there's a whole range of typologies there, and I think identifying those is really important to see which ones are getting helped and which aren't, and obviously help with policy design as well.
Thank you.
John Milne and then Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Chair. And this question is for Ed in particular. Getting a definition of child poverty that is accurate and meaningful is obviously a crucial first step, because in the end government interventions will be designed to answer those issues. The Social Matrix Commission was formed to try and build a common consensus on that definition. How far down the road do you think they've got with getting everyone to agree?
I think there was a fair bit of disagreement during the course of the Social Matrix Commission. I think by the end of it there was a fair amount of agreement on the compromise measure and the kind of various principles that we were trying to incorporate. What I would say is that the political landscape in the UK and internationally has changed quite materially since 2017, 2018, and I don't know if that same level of consensus may hold at this point. I don't know. I mean, largely, it's a case of the political right not being convinced of the value of relative poverty measures. That's largely what people mean when they refer to political consensus on the issue, because there are various different statistical and kind of conceptual difficulties with relative poverty, and I just think it's difficult to know what the political right will look like in Europe in 2 years, 3 years' time. So it's really difficult to say how far there's consensus around a lot of those issues, and I think in a lot of ways it's an issue of prioritization, and whether it would be a priority, whether measuring this properly would be a priority given constrained resources, I don't know. So not as optimistic an answer as I would have given a couple of years ago necessarily. But
thank you very much for your honesty. Peter is going to carry on.
As MP for an area with very, very high living costs, the costs for renting in Bracknell are as high as in many places in London, for example. I think a lot about how challenging it can actually be to identify what poverty means in a particular location, because it does differ, and it also differs for different groups because of the costs that certain groups face that others don't. How do you think our understanding of some of those complexities have actually evolved over time?
I think that development work, I can only really speak about the work that we've done on SMC and the work the government has done on below average resources, which is their version of the SMC metric. It's really clear that incorporating things like housing costs in full, so looking at mortgage costs as well as rental costs, looking at childcare costs in full, looking at the cost of disability in full, which we attempt to do by deducting out extra cost disability benefits, effectively saying that if, well, the government has said that this is a payment that you need to meet your costs, then it shouldn't really be considered an income. There should be we should assume that there's a cost on the other side of the ledger. That's the reason that you're receiving that payment, which is crude, and there's work to be done on all of that. There's work to be done on including debt, which at the moment the survey doesn't really allow you to do properly. I think what you do start to see when you include a lot of those things is that the profile of poverty gets younger, more complicated, a lot more young adults are in poverty, more children are in poverty, a lot more disabled people are in poverty, which I guess is kind of a necessary corollary of the different types of costs that you're including in the measure, but it does shift the population of people who are in poverty younger into more complex needs, into more disabled groups and groups that have higher housing costs, which maybe isn't surprising. But I think one thing that's worth noting is that the group of people that you're looking at really is very sensitive to the type of measure that you're using. The group of people who are in deep material poverty is very different to the group of people who are in relative poverty at 60% of median income. And I think it's potentially there's a lot of work making the case in the strategy, but I think it's being really clear about the group of people that we're identifying as being in poverty and being really clear about what their needs are and what can be done to help them. I think in a way choosing a measure you're kind of choosing a group of people to target, and I think that's not a decision that should necessarily be taken lightly, and I think development work in this area is important and will pay off in terms of improved understanding of the problem.
Could I just say one follow-up about that, because I think in your question there's something kind of implicit, or there's a question about whose understanding of poverty, and I think one of the things that's really interesting to think about is how many people who are themselves in poverty and probably facing with child poverty may not themselves identify as being in poverty, so they may, and we haven't sort of touched on it yet, and we may not get a chance because of time, but in the work that I do with Changing Realities, I lead a kind of coalition of over 200 parents and carers who are on a low income, so they are experiencing child poverty, and it's about them documenting their everyday lives and pushing for change. But many of them, for both kind of reasons of pride, things that Ruth's written about the stigma that comes to being in poverty, they wouldn't self-describe as being in poverty. And I think there's something really important there about the public and political will for action on poverty. And so I think there's a kind of, that is something that rests with the sort of political leaders and the narrative and the stories that we tell. But I think there's a really important, often disconnect between, if we even think about the child poverty strategy, and when we hear stuff in the media about, we want to see a reduction in child poverty, many of the parents who may well be benefited or may well be targeting that might think, oh, well, that's meant for somebody else, that's not meant for me. And I think there's a broader ambition and a drive that we need to have to kind of build awareness around how common it is. And I think I was really struck that now the rollout of universal credit is completely complete. Almost half of children are living in households where somebody is in receipt of universal credit, and I think there's a disconnect there, isn't there? So when we talk about issues of social security, or as people normally talk about it, welfare, we imagine, or we kind of manifest as if it's a minority, but really it's a really normal everyday part of life. So I think there's something that we need to kind of challenge and change there, especially if we're going to generate political will for further action on child poverty.
And if I could just add to that, by listening to people in poverty, I think we've got a better understanding now of what I call the psychosocial experience of poverty, and that may not affect policies for reducing the numbers, but it can affect policies for making the experience of poverty for those who are still in poverty, which are still going to be very many, a bit more bearable, and particularly thinking about public services, the training of professionals and officials, involving people with experience of poverty in that training and so forth, so there's a better understanding of how many people in poverty feel dehumanised, humiliated, and lack of recognition and respect.
Just quickly, I think that is a really important point.
Very quickly, Ed. We're seriously over.
Okay. The number of times we came up with a set of policies based on the tax benefit simulation and the data and said, this looks great, and then we took it to people who were in poverty, and it just absolutely did not align with their own lived experience of being in poverty. So the data can tell you one thing, but you should really speak to people as well.
Indeed, absolutely. That's why we have this lovely panel. Okay, moving on now to Joy Morrissey and then to Caroline Bowden.
We've heard that there are concerns about the quality of the Family Resource Survey and due to falling response rates and that impact that it may be having on poverty reporting. And do you share those concerns? And also, are there ways in general that you would recommend that the government improve its data collection at a national and local level? And this is just an extra, but is there any kind of European model that you saw that there was a country that you thought was a good model that should be looked at as a reporting standard?
I mean, in terms of the FRS, obviously it's sort of foundational to poverty measurement, and it is struggling, with sort of quality response rates. I think linking to benefit records is obviously really helpful. I think one of the challenges with low response rates in surveys, they can remain representative, but you're going to miss out on some of the smaller groups, and some of these groups are going to be those at particular risk of poverty. So that is a challenge. I think going back to the point about persistence and trying to identify people that are persistently in poverty, obviously with surveys, with point-in-time surveys like the FRS, you're not going to get at that. I do think a measure of persistent poverty, however you define poverty, but being able to identify families that are persistently in that state is really important. And so there it's a case of using longitudinal surveys like Understanding Society, and there was a persistent poverty sort of indicator target previously, and Income Dynamics is produced every year that gets at persistent poverty, and I think that's a really important tool to understand and track that kind of poverty.
If I can just say really, really quickly, so I'm not an expert on the FRS, but it's also about a plea for a recognition of the value of qualitative research and evidence bases, especially because they have an explanatory power. So we were hearing, I think, earlier from Ed about how, we can see a change, but we can't necessarily identify, what's caused the change. The beauty of qualitative research is that we can, and especially, sort of the gold standard of qualitative longitudinal research, where we sort of follow families over time, and we witness both the absence of change in people's lives. Again, and I'll be really quick, the other thing is that obviously with things like FRS, there's lags in reporting, or it takes time for things to show up. When we've done work on the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, or when we do the work on Changing Realities, we get or on the Scottish Child Payment, we get a real-time evidence base, and through Changing Realities, for example, we can speak to somebody this week who's been affected by the 2-child limit, and I think there's an issue too often that people say, well, that's an isolated case, it's just one person, and we need to actually say, well, no, let's hear that experience.
Yeah, that's a very good option.
Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. So my follow-up is to yourself, Ruth, and you've just begun to touch on it there. We know that there are many families who are distrustful of public services, of government, who might not want to respond to participate in surveys. So is there anything that the government could learn from the work you've done with Changing Realities to help improve engagement?
It's confusing having multiple Ruths.
Ruth Curtis here
I know. So I think, there's a lot, and Debbie will tell me off. So because of time, I would say, one thing is that, there is a real value in thinking about seldom heard rather than hard to reach. So it's about our language. I would also say, if the government and if policymakers want to engage with some of the, say, seldom heard group, they need to think about the language they themselves use in the public forum. So I think, far too often it's just become, easy to stigmatise, stereotype, belittle, individualise. And if that's the starting point, then you are going to experience that distrust. And then the last thing I'd say, because of time, but I can come back to if anybody wants, or follow up with a written submission, is that don't do it on your own. So I think too often there's a desire for control, or there's a desire for sort of, we need to keep control of this. And so say the DWP or the DFE, or even yourselves as a committee would think, we'll commission somebody, or we'll just get some seldom heard groups in. That isn't going to work. Work, in partnership. So work with organisations, groups like Changing Realities, who are doing this work well. They've got the expertise in how to do it. Don't try and do it on your own, I think would be a really important.
Okay, thank you very much. Helen Hayes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to just follow up on questions about monitoring and evaluation, and just to push a little bit on this question of targets. The Children's Commissioner for England has said that the government should have a target to have 0 children in deep material poverty. And I think that's something that everybody would like to see. I think we all see the egregious nature of deep material poverty for children and the moral imperative to eradicate it. But in terms of how the government measures meaningful progress towards its strategy objectives, and how, as select committees, we hold the government accountable for that progress, how helpful is a target of 0?
Well, I would. My starting point would be there have to be. I would support targets. They don't necessarily have to be legally based, but ideally would be. But I think really it's important that the baseline report in the summer includes some kind of target. I think usually when people are talking about a target of 0 child poverty, they mean probably about 10%. It should be below 10% because it's not realistic to think that absolutely nobody, and you'll always find somebody. I welcome the Children's Commissioner's sort of ambition in pushing for such a target, but it shouldn't detract attention from the broader targets of getting down the numbers in relative poverty in terms of income. And I don't think the government's argument, I supported Lord Bird in the Lords in pushing for targets, and I wasn't terribly impressed by the responses we got to that. The argument that, well, it's just pushing people over a line. Well, if you have a deep poverty target, it isn't that. So you have both. And I think targets if we look at Scotland, targets have proved really useful there, I think, in keeping the Scottish government to keeping on with its policy. I think they proved useful under the last Labour government. And a lack of targets could be seen as a government not showing confidence in its own strategy.
And just on the question of what a meaningful set of targets would look like, is it an adequate interpretation of what you're saying, that there should be targets are needed, but you need a mixture of different types of target with different levels of stretch within them? So ambition is important, which is, to speak to the Children's Commissioner's point, ambition is important, but so are kind of achievable targets along the way that help to get there.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. And I'd argue that, if the government doesn't like the word targets, perhaps we could go for milestones, but we need something to help parliamentarians, stakeholders, people in poverty themselves, to know to be able to hold the government to account.
Yeah, can I just say really quickly on that? The work by Child Poverty Action Group has talked very clearly about the need for targets that are, as you say, milestones or missions, like mission-led government, that are both kind of ambitious and realistic. And I think their suggestion was something like that we aim to halve it in a decade and eradicate it in 20 years. And I think, as Ruth says, the eradication would be to get it down to around below 10%. And I would just say that, Ruth very rightly points to the Scotland example, and we are seeing that divergence in poverty rates, but it's also important to compare Scotland with Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland has kind of a commitment on child poverty, but no measurable targets, and we see that in action, that Scotland, there is that drive. And finally, just really quickly, it's part of the public drive as well, like to actually be able to stand up and say, we are committed to tackle poverty, we want to eradicate child poverty. That helps that public narrative as well, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Damien Egan, and then a very quick question from Rushnara Ali.
Thank you, Chair. We're sticking on that theme around targets, and I agree. You need something at least to have that ambition if you're working against something. Should we not drill down a bit more within that, though, with targets? We've talked about poverty and the complexity, and it's different, how it impacts different groups, and actually having targets and monitoring of the strategy and how that's impacting on different groups. Now, if I think of my constituency and go to the schools, the teachers and heads tell me that it's the low-income white British families who they're particularly worried about. When I was a council leader in London, you could add into that in the area I represented, it was Black Caribbean children as well as white free school meals. And some of those groups persistently over decades get left behind. So how can we, in the monitoring of it, make sure that some of those, which I'd argue hard to reach groups, how can we make a difference and track what's happening to them?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I think with that deep and complex poverty definition, where you're identifying families that have particular sets of issues, sort of tracking poverty rates for those would help and would do that kind of thing. I think, within the HBAI report, there are statistics on poverty rates for lots of different characteristics of families, which are repeated annually, so it's quite straightforward to see trends in those statistics for different groups. But as I said before, I think identifying particular family types, and whether that's through their kind of socio-demographic characteristics, which is sort of easy to measure and identify, I suppose, or whether that should be around this notion of the sort of combination of drivers that they have, which really sort of points to families that have disadvantages that policy would focus on rather than just based on their characteristic. I think that's the question. I think we'd say pushing for a measure that identifies that complexity, so it gives you a feel for the challenges that the family have, whether it's around employment or health or family size, rather than purely based around their sort of socio-demographic characteristics.
Can I just say really quickly on that as well, that the Scottish Government have these 6 priority groups as well, so they have sort of identified groups and then they're using that as a lens through which to analyse progress. But I would also like to say that there's always a trade-off between trying to dig down and have lots of different targets for different different groups and categories, and having a kind of a very clear set of objectives that a government is working towards. And I think we just have to be a little bit cautious about that trade-off there.
I felt that
I just agree with that. I think yes, we need to monitor the impact on different groups, but not too many different targets, because then the targets become a bit meaningless. But could I also just throw in, because I think we're probably not going to have time to address it, the group who are so often overlooked, and that is migrant children whose parents have no recourse to public funds, and they are disproportionately at risk of poverty, and it's important that the sector was very pleased to see them acknowledged in the child poverty strategy, but there's nothing actually in the strategy that will immediately improve their position. So I hope they will be included in that monitoring.
Thank you. My question was really about the current geopolitical tensions and the impact of that on our economy and cost of living pressures and energy costs, and whether there's been work done around what the projections are likely to be of more children falling into poverty, and also what you think, because that then, in terms of the strategy itself, we've got the very welcome numbers of children who will be lifted out of poverty, but for those who are in work, with the risk of, if this crisis isn't prevented from going on for a long period of time, of a recession, what that means for in-work poverty, and whether you think that actually the strategy, alongside the strategy, government needs to be thinking about what it does to mitigate further more children falling into poverty.
Yeah, sorry. Just really quickly on that. So I think that's, I think the Resolution Foundation have done some analysis that's come out maybe just this week around, kind of modelling, different outcomes. And again, just reminding us that it's the poorest who are most at risk, of course, by escalating energy prices and cost of essentials, because so much more of their income it goes on those essential items. But again, it's just a reason, I think, for why that kind of engagement with lived experience is so important, because, with the work I'm doing on changing realities, we're getting diary entries in, lived experience in all the time, talking about the impact it's having already. So, the ways in which that pressure is just coming harder and harder. And, we had an example from somebody called Ronnie just at the beginning of this month, who was saying, how she feels successful when she's brought food for dinner and she still has access to the internet. And at the moment, she's got oil heating and she's having to go to Home Bargains to try and heat the house a bit before bedtime. And I think but the Home Bargains is out of stock for a week. So I think having that engagement with everyday realities is so important for understanding policy responses.
Just to say on that, I mean, clearly that people who are already so vulnerable and insecure are going to, of the most vulnerable and insecure in the face of what we're facing at present as a nation. And I really don't think we should be pitting their security against national security and arguing for cuts in social security spending, which is some people are doing, because actually we're going to need that basic support more than ever for those who are already in such serious, deep poverty.
Final question to David Baines.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, everyone. You've mentioned in different ways about lived experience and the importance of hearing stories of people. The government are going to produce a baseline report in the summer, which might mean autumn. In the summer, they intend to publish a baseline report around monitoring and evaluation framework. In your views, how do we effectively measure the impact of the strategy, its success, particularly by incorporating lived experience? How should we do that?
I mean, I think I should speak in like 30 seconds, really. But yeah, so I think what I would say is just that we need to kind of recognise people with lived experience of poverty as experts. So we need to kind of value their views, both not just as a kind of form of testimony, but more as, is this working, is this not working, so and so. And I think as part of the monitoring and evaluation, there is a commitment within the DWP to some new qualitative longitudinal research with families, which is valuable. But what I'd argue for is a small group, almost a bit like a committee of 6 to 8 parents that we return to, every, say, bi-monthly and say, how are your lives, how are they changing? Because just as Roshanara Ali's kind of question alluded to, things are changing all the time. So, yes, one thing, the two-child limit might be gone, but then energy prices might be sky high. So I think we need to have a small group of experts, lived experience experts that are part of the monitoring framework and that we're returning to over time.
Thank you. And that concludes the first panel for this second session.
order. Welcome back to the second half of our scrutiny session on the government's child poverty strategy. This is a part of our joint inquiry between the Education Select Committee and the Work and Pensions Select Committee, looking at the effectiveness of the government's child poverty strategy. I am Helen Hayes, I'm the chair of the Education Select Committee, and I'm chairing the second half of this evidence session. Can I ask our three witnesses to introduce yourselves to us? I'll start with the witnesses who are in the room. Can I ask Daniel Lilley to make a start, please?
Hi there, everyone. My name is Daniel Lilley. I'm the head of youth at the Centre for Social Justice.
Thank you. And Carl Cullinane.
Hi, I'm Carl Cullinane. I'm Director of Research and Policy at the Sutton Trust.
Thank you. And then online we have Alun Francis.
Hello, my name's Alun Francis. I'm the Chair of the Social Mobility Commission, and in my day job I'm the Chief Executive of Blackpool and Fylde Further Education College.
Thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to give us your evidence today. I'm going to start our questioning. In the child poverty strategy and in the subsequent schools white paper, the government has set out a number of policies to support disadvantaged children in schools, including extending free school meals, support with uniform costs and improved pupil premium funding. Do you think these policy interventions are the right ones, and what impact will they have? And I might start with you, Alun Francis, if that's okay.
Thank you. They're helpful, but I don't think they're necessarily sufficient. I think some of the roots of low educational attainment across the country are deep, and I don't think we've got in policy a really robust understanding of how that process works. I think it's linked to our shape of our economy, regional disparities. We see a clustering of low achievement in particular places, in particular areas, and that's been the case for decades. The only place that's bucked that trend has been London, which 20 years ago was one of the lowest performing places and now is the highest performing. The other areas, particularly post-industrial towns and seaside towns, have been persistently low achieving. So there's a complicated set of factors, I think, around this. And I think there's a very big distinction between how well the children of graduate families are doing compared to non-graduate. I mean, on average, I don't mean every individual case. And I think getting underneath understanding that and what the issues are behind that is really important if we really want to give everybody their opportunity. I also think there's a real dilemma about how we measure some of the outcomes here, because we seem to have slightly double standard. On the one hand, we measure the disadvantage gap through educational achievement focused on academic qualifications. On the other hand, there's a debate taking place about, well, do they really capture the range of qualities that people need to do well in life and work? And actually, perhaps they reward those who have those academic inclinations over others. And therefore, our measure is partly at fault as well. But I'll leave it at that for now. If you want to ask further questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Carl Cullinane, if that's okay. Next.
Yeah, I think there was a lot to welcome in both the child poverty strategy and the white paper. I think in particular the reinvigoration of the Best Start family hubs and increased rollout there, I think will have a substantial impact in terms of the impact of poverty on outcomes. Investing in those early years is obviously key. The evidence shows that the impact of material poverty is at its greatest in those early years. So support at that stage is incredibly important. I think there are questions about the scale of the rollout and also in terms of monitoring and evaluation of the model, making sure that the right programmes are being delivered by those family hubs, as well as addressing some of the variability in the provision across the country. I think we and a lot of other organisations welcomed the scrapping of the two-child limit, which will obviously have a material impact on the income of the poorest, and address some of those immediate pressures on costs in terms of particularly food poverty and the real precarity of living week to week, and that has tangible impacts on children in school. If you're hungry, it's much more difficult to learn. Schools have reported over the recent number of years, kids that are more distracted, kids that don't have the right uniforms or clothes, and that really impacts their day-to-day learning. And similarly, in the same vein, the extension of free school meal eligibility, which is something that we've been calling for a number of years, and the expansion of breakfast clubs. But I would agree with Alun in saying that this may not be sufficient in terms of narrowing the gaps and the scale of the gaps that we see. These are incredibly deep-seated issues, and that will require very long-term solutions. And the measures that have been brought in, I think, are really positive and should have a short-term impact. But what we need to do is see some of these policies kind of develop and be made more ambitious over time and sustained over time.
Thank you. Daniel Lilley.
Yes, I think I would concur with much of what the other two said. I think they covered both astute comments and covered a lot of the key bases in this. I think it's helpful when thinking about the child poverty strategy to zoom out a little as to what we're trying to achieve. Obviously, as was discussed at length in the previous panel, if we're focused on the number of children in child poverty as measured by relative low income, then most of these education measures are very unlikely to have a substantial impact, because the main thing they are seeking to do is unlock educational opportunity for children that can then improve their life prospects for decades to come, but won't necessarily likely to be having a large impact on the child poverty number. If instead we're looking at how can we have an education system where the opportunities for disadvantaged children to thrive are as good as they can be, I think these measures are much more important and much more encouraging. Pushing on a point that Alun made that I thought was excellent, when we look at the geographic disparities, I think one thing that we at the Centre for Social Justice would say we need to push much more is thinking about those children for whom the academic route from GCSEs to A-levels to university is not the most appropriate pathway, and there is nothing really for those children in our education system, and instead they're highly likely to become non-education employment or training, and to be in unstable work in the future if they find it. And to have an education system where we can try and rebalance and improve our technical pathways alongside academic pathways could be a really exciting thing here. And just a final note on that around geographic disparities. One way we see this is in how much London dominates the education system and how much it is designed around what works in the capital. So if we look at Progress 8 scores, performance at GCSE relative to performance at age 10, we see that everywhere in the country other than London is negative. And then London is more positive than anywhere is negative. It's that larger gap. We see the same sort of trend in higher education progression. And there's a sense that of course we do, because those professional jobs are also the jobs that are concentrated in the capital as well. So I think there's a larger question to ask in terms of the sweep of the education system around having really exciting opportunities with a line of sight to work for disadvantaged children.
Thank you. And just thinking about some of those issues about place. So the school's white paper sets out an approach to place-based missions. As a London MP, I can certainly speak to the impact that the London Challenge had on transforming educational outcomes across the capital. Can I ask what your view is of the approach to place-based missions that the government's articulated? What's needed to make them successful? And are there any risks, for example, as we saw with the London Challenge, where one area of the country then does substantially better, but there might be areas that are comparable in the extent of need and disadvantage, which don't get the focus of a mission and therefore are allowed to fall behind. Briefly, if you can, because we've got lots of questions to ask you, but what's your view of the place-based approach that the government's outlined? And again, I'll start with Alun Francis.
Thank you. So first of all, it's to be welcomed. Certainly from a Social Mobility Commission point of view, our view is that we need to rewrite our social mobility strategy in this country and focus on a place-based approach to social mobility. I'm happy to talk about that at length, but I'm sure we haven't got time for all the detail today. But what I would say is we have to be really careful about the differences between London and everywhere else. We know all of the data that the Social Mobility Commission has published shows that social mobility of the Dick Whittington type, the bottom to top mobility, is much more likely to happen to you if you live in London than anywhere else in the country. All of the outcomes are better for poor children in London than they are elsewhere in the country. And there are reasons for that, which we probably don't fully understand, but I'll try and shine a little bit of a torch on the issues as I see them. I think the social demographic in London is very different. I think there's a lot of highly aspirational immigrant families who value education very highly. It's important to remember that not all poor children do badly. There are real differences within the group. And one of the problems with the disadvantage gap is that it ignores the differences within the group. And you can see that by ethnicity and by place. When we start to think about the communities outside of London, I'm sure that members who are representing those communities will recognise lots of what I'm going to say. They work very differently. Their economy is different. The communities are different. Ambitions and cultural attitudes are different. Expectations are different. The institutions are different. You know, London has been able to drive these changes by attracting very high-performing graduates into teaching London schools. If you go to some of the seaside towns, they find it very difficult to recruit ambitious young teachers. These are just indicators of the differences. I think there's some wider issues underpinning it. I would also say, I hope this is not overly controversial, but I hope it provokes a bit of debate and thought. There's a lot of attention given to the left behind places, and particularly young men. I actually think if we want to solve child poverty, we've got to think about what career options and what life cycle opportunities there are for young women who don't go to university and live in those places. The mums, actually, and the pattern of having your first child for a non-graduate compared to a graduate is very, very different. I'll give you a couple of very quick statistics. I think the age at which you have your children is very different. And then the likelihood of being in a stable relationship is very, very different. And this is not about lone parents. This is about at the point at which your child is born, whether the child lives with both parents or doesn't at any point in time. And these are tied up with quite important differences between the opportunities we give to graduates, who tend to marry graduates, tend to be mobile, tend to access the highest employment, and what's happening to non-graduates in terms of their families and their communities. And I think if we don't recognise some of those differences and some of the challenges in left behind places, which are also about the transience of the community, the nature of housing, all kinds of related issues, then we won't really, by repeating the London Challenge or the Greater Manchester Challenge or the opportunity areas, if that's what we've got in mind, we've tried those things and they didn't work. We need to think harder about how we address that issue about creating real opportunities for poorer families and for the parents in those families, because we know the link between parental education and children's outcomes is very, very strong.
Thank you. Cullinane.
Yeah, just following up on that last point, I think the key thing is we do have to learn from these previous initiatives. There have been so many previous programmes from education improvement areas, education action zones, opportunity areas. We should be learning from the best of those. And I think some of the key learnings that have come through from those previous programmes were about the balance between local buy-in and local ownership alongside national investment and sustained national investment. And if you don't have both of those things, it's just not going to result in the outcomes that you want. There have been, positive signs in terms of increasing local collaboration, knitting across services from education, welfare, family support, and health, and those kind of increasing local collaboration can have a real impact. But as Alun says, some of these impacts are limited by local labour market conditions, and I think while the Mission Northeast and Mission Coastal are a really good place to start in terms of outcomes, I think what you would like to see is a much broader strategy that encompasses wider areas of the country and also helps knit together both the education side of things, but also the broader economic health of those areas. And I think without that more holistic strategy, you're not going to see the long-term impact that you would like.
Thank you. Daniel Lilley.
Yeah, I think very strong answers again from the other panellists, just to try and sort of, I suppose, provide something extra as well. Looking at the London Challenge both as sort of something that's encouraging and cautionary, I would suggest that I think part of the reason why the London Challenge caused London to become so far ahead was that there were other parts of the London economy, local economy, that were all doing very well. And actually, in that context, I think the place-based admissions now are particularly helpful, because if we look to the northeast, for example, yes, we have poor educational attainment and real disadvantage there. We also have twice the rate of children living in workless households than we do in London, and we also have much more vulnerable family formation. So the likelihood of a child being with their parents when they're 5 is much lower than it is in London as well. So I think when we consider that the complex web actually is all pointing in the direction that these areas need attention, I think it's really encouraging to see that. I think it's a very good idea.
Thank you very much. I will go to Darren Paffy next.
Thank you very much. So what policies then do you think the government should be adopting in order to improve educational outcomes for children in poverty, particularly bearing in mind what you've just been saying about, this is not about a carbon copy of the London Challenge. What could affect the rest of the country? Taking my constituency as an example, Southampton, we're in the southeast, so often get lumped in with, wealthy London in the southeast, and yet the poverty is sufficient to depress our educational outcomes below the national average. So whatever comes, or whatever policies there are, have to be able to improve the lives of poor children there. So what would some of those policies, do you think, look like? Start with Carl.
Yeah, I think there's a tension in the early years in particular with this positive Best Start for Life programme, with the lack of provision of early education to those from poorer backgrounds. So of the bottom third of the income distribution, 80% of those are not eligible for the 30 hours entitlement from 9 months to 4 years of age, and that means they're shut out of high quality education. It contributes to the attainment gap, a school readiness gap before they even start school, and then that only continues to widen afterwards. So there is a real tension there that I think that needs to be resolved if we're going to deliver on the promise of the rest of the Best Start for Life strategy. I would also say we need a more concerted plan around the attainment gap in schools. There was a really welcome commitment to having the disadvantage gap in the school's white paper, but I think in terms of the policies already announced, I think they're unlikely to reach that target, and I think we need to take further steps in that direction, in particular looking at funding from the national funding formula and rebalancing funding towards areas that need it most, improving pupil premium funding and targeting it at those who need the most, and looking at things like teacher recruitment in the most disadvantaged areas to improve schools in those disadvantaged areas, and also looking at school segregation across the country. So there's a very strong social segregation in schools between more affluent and least affluent areas, and if you're a poor student, even living in the catchment area of a good school, you're much less likely to go than someone who isn't. So I think we need to look at school admissions as part of that process as well, if we're to build that base for future opportunity. But yeah.
Thank you. Dan.
Yeah, so one thing we have found actually looking at the school absence crisis is that often children who are struggling very much in education, the variables that are most causing that are in the web around the child's life more broadly, as opposed to what's actually going on in their school experience directly. And time and again, when we speak to charities in our CSJ Alliance up and down the country, two things in particular come up, which is relationships in the home and worklessness. If a child has a secure relationship from their parents or guardians and loving relationships to them, and there's a stability at home, and similarly if there is work at home that is modelled to them, then generally speaking disadvantage in terms of income measures becomes much less relevant to their educational opportunities. And so in many ways the policies that would be most effective in terms of unlocking that opportunity are not directly in how we operate schools, but how we make sure that the child's life is such that school can be as effective as it can be. And time and again that comes down to relationship support, so that they have the best chance possible of having limited conflict at home and both of their parents around, and then support to get parents into work to ensure that they are modelled working life, that they're not the only person heading out of the home in the morning, that they know what it means to have a job, that there are some careers that they have seen and have access to, so they can think, would I like to do that with my life? And that school then feels tangible. And so to sort of give two specific policies to that end. One is around perinatal relationship support for parents. There's been brilliant expansion, as mentioned, in Best Start family hubs, and there's been some excellent expansion in children's social care in terms of relationship support, but preventative work to ensure that children have the best chance possible of their parents staying together is something that is not done much. Instead, we focus on purely medical things in that time. And that would be one thing. And then the second thing is around support to get people into work who are on health benefits. So talking therapies instead of just cash, so that you can try and actually find what is causing the challenge for the person and getting them into work so that then their child can have that model to them and improve their educational opportunities.
Thank you. Alun, Francis.
Thank you. So I won't repeat things that other people have said, but one of the things I'd say that's really important in terms of this issue is policy churn is a problem. We start things, we do things, we change them. We're constantly changing things in education, in early years, in schools, in post-16. It means we never become really good at anything, but also that's combined with the second problem, which is we're very poor at evaluation and learning from our mistakes and building knowledge about what genuinely works. So I would just flag up those issues right at the beginning. There are then a range of measures that in some respects we know quite well what works. There's a whole body of work on early years and its importance in terms of child development. We have a pretty good idea of what works in terms of schools. But what we struggle to do is roll that out across the country. So I mentioned earlier the improvement of schools in London, but we don't seem to be able to replicate that improvement elsewhere. And I think part of the challenge here is to think we need to go a little bit beyond the short-term measures and think actually we do need a long-term approach. And that's really difficult given the political cycle and various other things that mean there's an immediate pressure to get immediate results. I don't think there are really short, quick fixes to some of the problems we're talking about. What we do need is some policy consistency over a long period of time. And we need to be really focused on what are we asking our early years practitioners to do? Are we asking them to meet a target that we set them, or are we actually asking them to help families create the best environments for children to develop their cognitive, emotional, and other skills? And for me, that's the core. The core is the point I think somebody else made earlier about relationships being key. It's not just about material well-being; it's about the psychological transmission of the well-being, the emotional stability. All of those factors which help people to achieve well in their life and make the best of their abilities, academic or otherwise. And for me, that is about stretching our imagination a bit and thinking, actually, we do need policies that really integrate the need to create better opportunities for communities across the country. That's partly about the economy, but it's also about strengthening the public services and others around that, around some common goals. And I think that's about thinking about devolution more radically, thinking about how we can be more inventive about solving those problems based on place. And I would say that's the area I would look to say we need a long-term approach. And that's not to say there aren't some short-term things in the meantime that can be done. I think others have mentioned some of those, but I think if we want to really get to the root of this problem, which is an intergenerational problem that's been with us quite a long time, then we need to take that long-term view, and it needs to be a place-based approach.
Thank you. Just very briefly, in the government strategy and in quite a lot of the panel's answers, there is rightly a focus on early years and primary age children. Do you think there ought to be something specific policy-wise for secondary age children that would, again, help to improve those educational outcomes? I don't necessarily need all of your to answer, but if anyone's got a burning kind of response, that would be helpful.
I would like to respond if I may.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't think it's just secondary. I think you've got to look at adult learning. It's about parents too. It's about communities. Adult learning is a neglected part of the system. It's absolutely crucial to being able to address some of these issues, because if we don't help improve the outcomes for parents, we're saying it's all based on early years practitioners, schools, to do that on their own. I just think that holistic approach has to start with adult learning and think about the education system as a whole, and that isn't just about children.
Thank you. Do you have a quick point on that?
Just one sentence. I mean, that was excellent, actually. I think vocational education is another big one in terms of having that balance of pathways. That was what I was going to focus on.
Sorry, one quick thing I would just add. The pupil premium ends at 16 and ends at GCSE and does not extend into post-16 education. Disadvantage doesn't end at 16, and we should ensure that funding supports those who stay in school.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to bring in Chris Vincent.
Just really briefly, Danny, you were talking about the importance of relationships at home, and also that sort of was quite modelling, but modelling like work. Struck me, I declare interest, I'm the chair of the APPG for young carers and young adult carers. So I suppose, without sort of giving you an answer, would you suggest then that there is definitely a clear need for government to focus policies on young carers then, because actually they, in those two particular measurements, they're going to really struggle, aren't they?
Yeah, I think it's an extremely important point, and it also illustrates that when we talk about family relationships, it's more complicated than just the relationship between child's parents. But yeah, absolutely, I agree that's also an important part of that. I do think that, I suppose, the biggest scale family relationship sort of variable is also underrepresented in conversations, which is, are the child's parents married, which has a huge impact on whether the child's parents like to be together when they're 16. And because obviously that's the family's decision, we feel uncomfortable mentioning it as a variable. But it's highly significant in the child's opportunity. So I'd completely agree with you, and would just highlight that as another example of the various areas within that theme.
Thank you. Irina Breckenridge.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is for Alun Francis. You have spoken previously about your frustration of how disadvantaged is badly defined in education, and how too often time isn't spent working with the most disadvantaged. So in your opinion, how should government policy ensure that they're reaching the most disadvantaged children?
Thank you. So I think part of the problem of the way that we use what I would describe as binary definitions of disadvantage, we use free school meals, or we might use family income, we might use an area that you live in and so forth. And the fact of the matter is that they're all helpful in shining a light on where we should put our attention. But it's really important to say that statistics give us averages, they give us average outcomes, and that's not the same as individuals. Individuals are never completely average. So I think the key to this is to try and understand what the kind of baskets of issues are that might affect a particular individual. And that's also about thinking hard about things like the way we set targets. So, for example, I want to just pick up this point about the disadvantage gap and pupil premium. I understand why Carl and others are really supportive of that. It worries me, in all honesty, because I think what those initiatives tend to do is the institutional behaviour that follows is to focus on the marginal gains that can be made. And this often happens with improvement programmes like London Challenge too. We look at the students that are marginal in terms of a grade D to a grade C, for example, because that helps meet the target. But we tend to then ignore the wider issues around disadvantage. And those who are in the most need often don't see a great deal of intervention in that respect. So one of my concerns would be to say we need to think about the implications sometimes of the way we tackle these problems, because we create incentives to do the wrong thing rather than the right thing. And actually what we do need to do is have a proper strategy for saying we need to pick up people on the basis that they're falling behind. So if I give you an example, I'm sorry I haven't given you a coherent explanation of every single measure we might do, but if I give you one example. In post-16 education, around about 220,000 children enter post-16 education without their English and maths. And it is true that of those who failed their English and maths at GCSE, you're much more likely to fail it if you come from a poor background, whichever definition we use, than a more advantaged background. But if we look at the absolute numbers, actually, those who are disadvantaged, we're using whatever measure, are smaller in number than those who are apparently advantaged. As 99,000 meet the definition of disadvantage, whereas 120,000 didn't. My point would be that they're all disadvantaged because they haven't got their English and maths. And sometimes the way we set targets doesn't encourage us to focus on actually that's the disadvantage that we need to solve. We want those young people to all enter the labour market with an equal and fair chance in life. and I think that is a theme that runs through policy more generally. So it's about, I think, really focusing on solving the problem we want to solve, whereas sometimes the metrics and the targets lead us away from that and give disincentives to deal with real human beings.
Thank you very much. I'll go to John Mill next.
Thank you, Chair. The government set a bold ambition of halving the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers at GCSE. How far do you think the measures that have been set out on the child poverty strategy and then in the school's white paper go towards meeting that goal? Carl, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I think I've said already. There's a number of really positive things in there. I think the extension of free school meals will be really positive. I think improving wider services, wider family support services, particularly through the family hubs, I think will have a significant impact. It will also help in terms of early identification of problems, particularly SEND. SEND is contributing substantially to that disadvantage gap, and I think the reforms that have been announced, I think, are I would say cautiously positive in terms of addressing some of those issues in the long term, and that early identification and intervention is going to be key to that. But I think there's a number of measures, I think, under consultation later in the year, so I think some of it remains to be seen. So, as I mentioned, the national funding formula and how much funding is being directed to schools with the greatest needs, facing the biggest challenges. We see the pupil premium has been massively cut in real terms by inflation over the last number of years. And also, the way, as going back to what Alun said, the government is looking at how to measure the disadvantage that applies to these funding formula. So bringing in a measure of household income in particular, and that could solve some of the issues that Alun has identified in giving a less binary measure of disadvantage, and that could be very helpful in terms of both the national funding formula and the pupil premium, and in particular targeting at those suffering the most. So in the deepest poverty, in the most persistent poverty, which all the statistics show are the ones who face the biggest challenges. But we do need to see a bit more of a holistic approach going beyond the white paper, looking at teacher recruitment, as I say, particularly through a geographical lens, looking at school admissions, but also looking at specific interventions. So the national tutoring programme that was brought in during the pandemic was defunded a couple of years ago, and our research has shown that the level of tutoring provision in school has declined substantially since the end of that programme. The intention was that the pupil premium would fund tutoring in the longer term, but what we're seeing is a dramatic reduction. One-to-one and small group tutoring is one of the most effective interventions a school can give to those particularly from a disadvantaged background, and I think more targeted investment on interventions like that I think are going to be really key if we're going to meet some of those targets. And similarly when it comes to pupil absence, as Daniel has mentioned, that's a huge driver of the gap, and what we need there is both a cultural shift in terms of attitudes to school and attendance, which have gone in a negative direction over the last few years, but also a stepping up of substantive interventions to address those with individual pupils.
Thank you. A very thorough answer. Daniel, anything you want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I suppose I would start by saying it's an extraordinarily ambitious aspiration, to the point where one has to be somewhat sceptical, particularly considering the vague framing. It was an ambition, and it was by the time this generation had finished school. Sort of it feels that there were intentionally no sharp edges to how that was pledged. For context, in 15 years of the disadvantage gap being a key educational priority, its total variation from the high point to the low point has been 11%, a fifth of what is targeted. So that is an unbelievably ambitious aspiration for something that doesn't then have a huge plan as to exactly how on earth that will be done. Two very quick observations that I would want to colour in points that have already been made on the disadvantage gap. Firstly, we did a piece of research looking at the effectiveness of pupil premium, obviously where the measure came in from. And one thing we found was that in the secondary schools where disadvantaged students perform better than the national average for all students, so in the schools that are doing well for disadvantaged students, the disadvantage gap is still quite large. And actually for many of those schools, it's larger than it is on average across the country. So the schools where disadvantaged students do the best still have a large disadvantage gap. The second observation I would make is that the disadvantage gap, if we pick one characteristic, ethnicity as a characteristic, it is far larger for white British children than it is for Chinese children. It's far larger than it is for black African children. It's far larger than it is for Bangladeshi children. And I suppose taking those two observations, I would come back to my earlier point, not to sound like a broken record, that it's often the web behind the child's life, more so than the direct experience of school, that is causing these things. And it tends to come back to family relationships and worklessness. Why did disadvantaged Chinese children do so well? Well, I would argue that those two things are highly relevant in that. So those would be my sort of key observations on that ambition.
We are at the point in the proceedings when I need to encourage brevity so that we can get through all the topics that we want to ask you about, if that's okay. But do carry on.
Thank you. Alan, anything to add to that? Or?
I will be very brief, but I'm just a sceptic where the disadvantage gap is concerned. I think it creates institutional behaviour that focuses on the margins. I think it doesn't look at the wider issues underpinning that, which is where policy really needs to focus, and it tends to measure everybody against the same measure. It's a bit like taking every horse in the country, from show ponies to show jumpers to Grand National racers, and saying you've all got to run the course at Aintree and jump over the same fences, and we'll measure you on that basis. And actually what we need is something that's much more nuanced about measuring the ability for people to fulfil their potential, not be measured against what is actually quite an arbitrary external measure. I'll leave it at that. Happy to deal with further questions if anybody wants to pick that up outside of the meeting or in future, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much.
I think Mark was...
I think we're going to go to David Baines at this point, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Just picking up on that point, expanding that a little bit more, I'm interested in what you said earlier, Alan, about us not really understand your sort of apprehension about the way some people use the term disadvantaged and what that means and the complexity behind it. In terms of the attainment gap and the effect on disadvantaged children, and however we define that, do you think the government and the child poverty strategy, do you think it does enough? Do we understand enough about what causes those gaps and those differences in whether it's ethnicity, class, gender, region? Do we know enough to develop the right policies to make a real difference?
Thank you for the question, because I think it's a brilliant question. We know a lot, but we don't know everything. And I think in the context of this country, one of the things that's different in this country is the extent of regional disparities. And the reason I mention that is that if I was to read out for you some of the areas in the country where, if I go back to my point earlier about families and areas of the country where so I'll just give you a quick stat on family formation, which is that people who are high achieving educationally are 68% of those people are likely to get married before, either before or at the point they have children, and only 6% will have children when they've got no partner. If you look at people with low educational achievement and outcomes, only 17% are likely to be married, and 29% are likely to not have a partner at the time the child is born. Now, this isn't raising it as a moral issue. I'm raising it as a question about what it is that's driving people into these very difficult situations. And I'm saying it from a point of view of sympathy, not criticism. If I then tell you that the geography of that maps straight across to that data and tell you that, and I'm not naming these places to shame them, I'm naming them because we know they've got low education attainment, but this is also a factor that is present in those communities. The areas with the highest numbers of children born when the parents have never been a couple. Some of these areas are up to 35% of children born in that situation. Knowsley, Hartlepool, Halton, Liverpool, Merthyr Tydfil, Blackpool, many of the places I've worked figure on the list. Out of the top 34 boroughs with the highest rates of non-partnered births, only 5 are in London. The rest are all across the post-industrial and seaside towns. Now, I think the problem with family is it's such a sensitive issue. People feel really anxious about it. They don't want to be judgmental. They don't want to blame the victim and so on. And I get all of that. I understand all of that. But I think we have to really start to think hard about what's happened to the non-graduates in those communities that are sometimes referred to as left behind. And in particular, young men and young women, what choices they have and what opportunities they see themselves as having. So very often when they have families, they're having them very young, they're not together as a couple, the man disappears. The woman is in a very difficult situation of how she improves her circumstances from that point onwards. And this does appear to be linked to the cluster of issues, not one issue causes the others, there's a cluster of issues that place children at risk in terms of developing their full range of abilities to the best that we can. So the answer to your question is, we know a lot, for example, about the importance of early years. There's Nobel Prize winning economists like James Heckman who have done loads of research on it. There's tons of examples of randomized control trials across the world. We know quite a lot about what improves school performance. We might argue about some of the things on the margins, but actually we know quite a lot about that. What we don't really understand is, well, what is it about the other side of this equation in communities and in families, and what's happened to those families over a 30 or 40 year period where we've seen the long-term implications of industrial decline, and that's affected quite a lot of areas outside of London and its immediate surroundings. And it is a unique feature, by the way, of this country. This level of non-partnered births is much higher in the UK than anywhere else in the world. The only country that comes nearest is the USA. Europe doesn't. And the geographical patterns are unique to this country. It's to do with the extent to which we've, for 30 or 40 years, not solved the problem of a low-performing economy outside of London and the South East. In fact, we've fuelled the growth of London and the South East by taking our graduates out of areas like Oldham and Rochdale and Blackpool and sending them to London to work in professional and financial services, which has been great for them, not great for the areas they've left behind, and certainly not great for the people that are left behind who, there isn't an ecosystem for them to do well in. And that's what we need to fundamentally solve, because the geographical patterns to this are absolutely clear.
Thank you very much. Do you think government, so all this is known, and this evidence is known, I've heard it in lots of different places as well, it's good to hear from you so eloquently today. Do you think that evidence, though, the scale of it, the weight of it, the importance of it is appreciated across government?
No. I think it's a complex picture which makes it very difficult for people to piece together the full jigsaw puzzle. I think that's a challenge, and I think we tend to work and live in silos. I would argue that my motive for piecing this together comes from working persistently in areas which are left behind in one way or another, and asking simple questions like, well, the reason I joined the Social Mobility Commission was, what does social mobility mean to people growing up in Oldham, which is where I worked at the time, and now in Blackpool. And actually the models that we have don't mean a lot to them, and we need to develop models that do mean a lot to them, and that's where a lot of our work has been focused, and why we're now working on a place-based strategy for social mobility, which integrates economic, educational, social and cultural issues, and really the way of delivering that would be through a much more powerful devolution model.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. I will bring in Serena next.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Carl. The Sutton Trust has done much work to highlight the double disadvantage faced by children in poverty and have SEND. So what policies should be put in place to support this particular group of children?
Thanks. Yeah, this is a key, as I said earlier, a key part of the disadvantage attainment gap is contributed by SEND. Early identification and support is really important through the Best Start family hubs, but also through childcare and early education settings. And we need to get more kids from disadvantaged background into those settings at an earlier stage, so we can support them earlier before those problems kind of bloom and affect them greater at later ages. But I think there are also wider issues within the operation of the system more generally. As we've seen, and there's been a lot of talk about the HCP structure, which is a very high stakes cut-off. And when you have very high stakes cut-offs, that tends to advantage those with the resources, the know-how to navigate those systems. And our research has shown, quite substantive differences in terms of the number of pupils with SEND and free school meals who are able to access those kind of supports, basically. And so I think the reforms announced earlier this year, I think, are positive from that perspective. So I think it was important to retain the EHCPs, and particularly for reassuring the families who already have them. But I think what has been announced in terms of there being a more holistic offer across the range of needs, I think is really important. It reduces that high stakes cut-off between EHCPs and just SEND support, because the funding for quote-unquote just SEND support over recent years has effectively been declining because more and more resources have been pumped into HCPs. So that more stepped approach, I think, is really positive in terms of getting those supports to more disadvantaged pupils. But I think it's also about looking at the range of different types of SEND. It's an extremely broad category, and the patterns are different depending on different types of households. And there is sometimes a kind of bi-causal relationship. So some pupils who are from disadvantaged backgrounds are labelled as having SEND simply because they're behind, not because they have a diagnosable disorder. So we need to look at that. And then there's also a bi-causal relationship in terms of the impact of SEND in terms of driving people into poverty. Our research has shown a lot of parents reduce their hours, leave their jobs, in order to support their children, particularly those who have very high needs. And those families need support in terms of addressing those. So I think broadly positive in terms of the announcements that were made earlier this year. But as there's going to be a very a slow kind of lead in over the next few years, I think we need to monitor that closely.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Caroline Johnson very briefly. I do need to encourage brevity at this point, with increasing urgency as we get towards our cut-off of 11:30. Caroline.
Sure, I shall do my best. I wanted to go just back to what Mr. Francis said about women having children without a partner at the time of the baby's birth. And I wanted to understand really what your view is on the causation behind that. Is this an unplanned pregnancy's failure of access to contraception, or is this predominantly related to a cultural shift in whether having a second parent is desirable or necessary?
Thank you. There's an absolute excellent report done by the Institute of Fiscal Studies in 2022 on this, which I'll send the reference through for anybody who wants to read it. And it's a very nuanced and balanced report that pulls together what's quite a complex set of evidence. There are clearly changes in cultural expectations applying to all socioeconomic groups in relation to marriage, for example, cohabitation or non-partnered births. But the evidence in that report suggests that this is, first of all, there is quite a distinctive difference between people from different social backgrounds in terms of whether they end up, in which of those categories they may end up. And it's very difficult to say, without some further research, what the exact answer to your question is, whether they're unplanned pregnancies or whether they're not. It's difficult. It's just very difficult to say. What I would say is that, and this is an anecdotal observation really, when we see young people who come into an FE college, they're much more varied than people like to think. FE colleges tend to have students who perhaps have not done as well at school as might go to a more academic institution. But within that group, there's huge variation, massive differences. We've done some work at Blackpool over the last few years on what I would call some of the most disadvantaged. And we've looked at family size, area they live in, the course that they're on, and so on. We collected some data on enrolment, which has allowed us to look at that in a bit more detail. It's very early embryonic research, if you like, but it does tend to show a really strong pattern between which course you're on, particularly for what we call entry-level or level 1 courses, which are fairly introductory courses, really, and your family size, the number of siblings you've got, and whether you live with one or both parents. So there is a connection here. Understanding what's sat behind it is much more complicated, but I do think there are issues here to do with what choices and options graduates appear to feel they have compared to non-graduates. So I don't know whether that completely answers your question, but it's the best I can do at the moment.
Thanks. I'll move us on to Mark Seward's next.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got 3 questions that I'll condense into one for the sake of time. There are organisations and individuals that suggest that halving the attainment gap should be part of a cross-government approach and target that actually doesn't just sit solely with the DfE, but should be recognised by the child poverty strategy as a key measure to reducing child poverty. Teach First is one of the organisations that said that. So my question really is, should targets on reducing the attainment gap or other targets relating to educational outcomes be used to monitor and determine progress on the child poverty strategy? And if so, which targets, which indicators should be used? I'm tempted to start with Carl on this one, if that's okay.
Yes, I think I agree. I mean, there are 2 broad goals of the poverty strategy in terms of alleviating poverty itself, but also alleviating the impacts of poverty. And those educational measures and labour market measures are key to that second one. And I think the attainment, there is no perfect measure, of these things, but I think the attainment gap at GCSE is a real key one, measured by either progress or absolute attainment in terms of attainment 8. But then also I think looking at labour market outcomes as well. We now have the longitudinal educational outcomes data that shows the earnings, labour market earnings of people depending on their education and also their social background. And I think while it should be couched in a long-term sense, because social mobility is always viewed through the rear window, we should be thinking about what proportion of those in poverty now can we help to escape poverty in 10, 15 years' time.
That's fine.
I'm going to move us on, actually, if that's okay, and ask other witnesses if you can follow up in writing if you've got really burning points to make in response to that question, just for the time. And I'll go to John Milne. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Very quick question, I hope. Should the strategy include explicit targets for relating to social mobility, and if so, what kind of targets might it set? Daniel, if I kick off with you.
Yes, I think that there's overlap with those 2, so I'll just give very brief thoughts. I suppose the first thing I'd say is that child poverty is obviously a relative income measure. It has immense value, but in terms of educational opportunity, it's not really what it's looking at. So having things that look at educational opportunity would be very helpful. The only other comment I'd make is when trying to understand the disadvantage of a child in terms of their educational opportunities. As I mentioned, income is instructive, but it's also very much reductive, and other things in terms of worklessness, family structure, and other related issues are very helpful to understand that picture.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, I would echo that, and overlaps with my previous answer. But I do agree. But in the context of these are very long-term outcomes, and that we shouldn't expect things to change quickly.
Thank you. And Alun, same question.
I will be very careful on the social mobility one. The question is which type of social mobility, because there's lots of different ways of measuring it, and some have a much greater impact on everyone, and some end up being just very focused on what we call the lucky few. I would also just be very sceptical about setting macro targets based on attainment gaps, etc. For this reason, well, there's a number of reasons. One is that they're not always as scientific as people like to think. Some of the statistical quirks in there can be lost by just having a very crude gap. But here's the question I'd leave you with. So if we were happy, would we be happy if 50% of every socioeconomic group did well and 50% of them did badly? Would we be happy that the group outcomes were equal? But we've still got 50% of the population not doing that well. So my concern is if we ever use a gap, we must also weight it by also looking at the actual numbers of people who are not doing well, because otherwise you get a very artificial view of what you're doing, and actually you're just playing off one group against another, and that is not a recipe for a happy society.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll go to Peter Swallow for a final question.
Thank you so much, and Alan, this is to you as well. Obviously, the Social Mobility Commission was originally set up following the previous child poverty strategy, in order to monitor it. What, if any, role do you expect the SMC to play in monitoring progress of this new child poverty strategy?
Well, I think it depends on whether you've... So I'm glad you've mentioned our previous role. I think it's quite an interesting question, and I know we haven't got time to delve into that. Partly it depends whether you want a narrow or a wider view of the role of the Commission. Any member of Parliament can ask the Commission to look at various issues and give advice on it, and we will do our best to draw on the evidence we can to advise how that should best be done. And we could give you some advice on this particular question and look at the data we've got and how that might help you. I would say, though, that I think I'm increasingly of the view that the role of the Commission needs to be broader based on all the things I've talked about. And I think it needs to measure a wider set of factors which relate to good outcomes for every child, but they start off with places, economic opportunity, the whole range of things that we've talked about. So I think there's a narrow answer to your question, which we could deal with an advice note, which would, I think, be very helpful. But there's a broader issue for us about, we think perhaps actually the role that the Commission more broadly should have is about trying to capture opportunity across the country. And in that respect, it's about good growth as much as traditional concepts of social mobility.
That's really helpful. I appreciate that answer, but just very specifically, will the Commission be including updates on the progress of the strategy in its annual reports alongside all of the broader work that you want to be doing?
Well, in the sense that we already cover a range of measures, most of the things that would be relevant to the child poverty strategy will be measured in there. So we have a whole bank of data around outcomes for children, intermediary outcomes, long-term outcomes. So in that respect, yes, and I'm sure we'll be able to make reference to the strategy specifically. If we want to talk about the wider issues we've talked about today, then that's a slightly different question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all three of our witnesses for taking the time to give us your evidence today. It's been an absolutely fascinating session. I am sorry that, as we always are, we are really constrained on time and that we didn't always have time to get into the depth of detail that we would have liked to. Please do write to the committees with any further points that you were not able adequately to get across in the time that we had available today. But that brings our evidence session to a close for today. Order.